Welcome. My name's David Malone, and I have the privilege of working at the UN University, which is headquartered in Tokyo. And today we have the honor of having with us Michael Doyle, very distinguished American political scientist, but who, like many great scholars, started ranging over several disciplines later in his career and has enriched them all. And that is part of what we'll be discussing today. He's a professor at both the law school and the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Much of his career was spent at Princeton University. He also served Kofi Annan as Assistant Secretary General and Policy Advisor and worked very closely with Annan in that function. He knows the UN very well. He served as vice president of the International Peace Academy, a think tank that isn't part of the UN but works alongside it quite closely. And in particular, during a period of about 20 years or so, was intensely involved in the scholarship of conflict. And our topic in Tokyo today isn't really conflict, it's slightly more abstract in a way. What we'll be discussing this evening in Tokyo is rooted in the thought of John Stuart Mill, a discussion about intervention. And Michael, I wanted to ask you first about John Stuart Mill and why he was thinking about intervention in the middle of the 19th century.
It's a really important topic, David. But let me first say what a great pleasure it is to be here. The UNU as an institution should be one that is the very heart of what the United Nations is about. This is an institution that has to live with its ideas. And all of us who have observed the UN were just so delighted when you took over the rectorship as someone who can actually do that. Now to your question. Intervention is incredibly important. This is an essay that he wrote in 1859. It's at, I would say, the very peak of British power in the 19th century. This is the greatest world power in a way that we don't see again in history until after World War II when the US emerges. So an immense concentration of power. And it's a country that is beginning to see the emergence of a liberal party, his own party, that was committed to a different way of politics, that is democratic participation to a large degree, freedoms domestically. And what Mill then said, what does this mean internationally? That we have these beliefs in British constitutional liberty. What does this mean for how we should treat foreign people? And that's the motivation behind his thinking on intervention.
Now, since then, we jump ahead over 100 years. Yes. We start having a debate, I suppose, about 15 years ago, 16 years ago, arising from some of the conflicts of the 1990s, Rwanda, the Balkans with genocide in Rwanda, a genocide at Srebrenica, also a sense that the international community and the UN in particular doesn't have the intellectual tools, in a sense, to deal with the quandaries that those particular events raised, and that Kofi Annan perceived as Kosovo raising about 5 years later.
Yes.
And as I recall, you know Kofi much better than I do, but Kofi was haunted somewhat by both Srebrenica and Rwanda.
Yes.
And when he saw a repeat of what he felt was a variation on the Bosnia theme, he became tremendously worried and did feel the international community had a responsibility to prevent that from recurring.
Yes.
And that's what really triggered, I think, what was often quite a sharp debate in the international community.
Yes.
How do you think Mill's ideas, in a sense, are relevant to that recent debate?
I think they're relevant in the following way. Mill raised questions about when to intervene. But what he understood from the very beginning, which is absolutely essential, is that intervention is a complex moral and political calculation. And for him, it's driven by the contest of three principles that sometimes work in the same direction, but often contradict each other. And the principles are the principles of humanitarian protection. That is that every human being on this planet has some claim on our attention and sympathy. The second principle is self-determination. That is that in order to have decent political communities, they have to have political borders. They have to be able to rule themselves. And the only way that one can do that legitimately is if the people themselves decide how they're going to be ruled, rather than foreigners. And then the third principle, he understood that in a world without a world government, every country has a security issue. It has to be able to protect itself. And those three principles sometimes support each other, sometimes strain against each other. And that's the heart of the problem that Kofi Annan identified too in the wake of what was happening in Kosovo. On the one hand, he saw a commitment coming out of human rights, the Universal Declaration as a ethos behind the UN. And on the other hand, he well knew, as every UN person does, is that the UN is an institution to protect domestic sovereignty. It is an institution of states, not to replace states. And so we saw a fundamental tension between the moral commitment to protect people under great stress whose lives were at risk, and on the other hand, the duty to protect sovereignty. And those were the two things he saw in such great tension coming out of Kosovo.
Absolutely. And on the issue of sovereignty, we've seen that most member states really prize their own sovereignty. But we live in an era when the sovereignty of other states is somewhat less prized by them, which makes the states themselves quite worried about their own sovereignty. Yes. So while most states would like to think of themselves as positive actors in international relations, the truth is most of them would very much like non-intervention to be the rule as far as their borders are concerned.
Yeah, again reflecting that deep tension. That is, that on the one hand, with the Universal Declaration, with the experience going back, remembering back to the Holocaust, but thinking about the more recent experiences of Rwanda, of Bosnia, again then Kosovo, and the many since, there is a sense of solidarity, at least at the rhetorical level, that no people is an island in that regard, and that the suffering elsewhere is suffering that we experience. But they also well remember the ways in which similar kinds of statements were used for imperial conquest, so that throughout the 19th century, you would find claims: we have to rescue the Indians from sati, we've got to rescue the Africans from slavery, we've got to rescue the Latin Americans from corrupt military governments, then turning into what were basically the banners waving behind in front of imperial campaigns. So that humanitarianism and imperialism historically had an ambiguous and corrupting occasional, not a marriage, but a series of affairs that produced outcomes that for many third world governments undercut the humanitarian claims of global solidarity.
Now, I think you were involved at least as much as I was. Following on this dilemma, which Kofi Annan articulated clearly in a speech to the General Assembly in 1999, I think, a number of efforts to think through how these often clashing principles, in fact, they aren't just not mutually reinforcing, they sometimes clash, could be reconciled towards optimal outcomes. A number of efforts were undertaken to think through how this could be constructed most effectively. And in 2005, there was an unexpected outcome, in a sense, in that it was a positive outcome at the level of the international community.
Right.
How do you think Mill would have judged that outcome?
I think that he would have been supportive, if I could channel his thinking, in the following way. He saw the tension between humanitarian protection, self-determination, and national security as the heart of what it means to make policy. And that tension has shown up again and again. The UN attempted to come to terms with the duty to provide humanitarian protection. And we have the Kosovo Commission, which issued a report, and it was quite a good report, examining what happened there. But the standards that it put in play were very broad and nebulous about protecting human rights and things such as that. And so, attractive as that might seem, it set off alarm bells in the global South. They saw this as being an excuse to engage in illegitimate interventions in their part of the world. It's at that point that Canada stepped in Canada doing the kind of things that historically it had done so well before, which is a public entrepreneurial role. And there was a commission that was set up that was very important, the Commission on Responsibility to Protect, the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, right there embodying the contradiction. Notice intervention, state sovereignty, covering both. But they did some excellent research done by many of our people that you and I happen to know.
And one of them, a UNU vice rector at the time, Ramesh Thakur.
That was Ramesh Thakur. But others were involved with him, did some excellent work, and they produced a much better report than the Kosovo Commission when it came to standards. It limited it to extreme abuses and a commitment to go to the Security Council first. And all of that was moving in the right direction. And Kofi Annan, when the report came through, tried to promote it within the UN system because he thought this was such an important contribution. But still, for the member states, they were too nervous. That is, this still opened up the door to illegitimate intervention. And then through some very good diplomacy led by those behind this report, eventually the statement that's produced is the 2005 statement. And there we see a million reconciliation of the duties to stop things like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, but only as a last resort, acknowledging that this is first a national responsibility, self-determination. Second, that the international community should assist countries to do this. And only thirdly, if countries fail, is there a residual responsibility, but then again, only through the Security Council mechanisms, again designed to protect legitimate sovereignty and in ways that the membership eventually found acceptable. The 2005 document that I was just quoting from is a unanimous General Assembly declaration, and it's a reasonable reconciliation, in my view at least.
I would agree, and I think we'll see it both used and abused in the future, which doesn't invalidate it in effect. We also see, unfortunately, continue to see leaders of countries who flout the basic standards that responsibility to protect, as that set of ideas came to be known. And we still see a reluctance of potential interveners, not militarily, but even politically, to stand up to these figures.
Right.
And so we have a new instrument in international relations since not very long ago, really, about 15 years, I suppose, or 13 years since it came into force, the International Criminal Court, which is a different take on how you deal with some of these extreme abuses.
Yes.
So in that sense, the international system, and the UN in particular, has been quite busy trying to address, in a way, both prevention by making clear in extreme cases that punishment may ensue,
Yes.
but also trying to reassure states that there will not be a sort of marauding UN posse picking up every leader, because ultimately it's leaders who worry.
Yes. And with the ICC, we see a similar attempt to try to provide a degree of protection for the most basic human rights, that is, avoiding unnecessary deaths, but through a different strategy. You know, rather than having collective policies that use states and the international system through the Security Council, here we're creating individual liability, sending a message to potential perpetrators that shielding oneself in the cloak of sovereignty will not, in many cases, be successful. Now, it opens up the door to potential liability in this way, to send a message that your behavior will be examined and maybe even punished by the international community. But again, this is not a tough posse being sent out to patrol the international system. The ICC works only when states have signed up to it, so there's sovereign decision to join, and many powerful states, the US, Russia, China, of course, have not, which greatly limits the scope of this institution. And then there's been opened a door for the Security Council to step in cases where states have not become parties. But again, it takes a Security Council resolution, meaning with the agreement of the P5 and the other votes that are needed. So again, respecting sovereignty, constraining, not creating a tough sheriff to rule the world, but again, only in those exceptional circumstances where the Security Council can come to a degree of consensus that this is so egregious that action may be needed, as for example, it was judged to be with regard to Libya in March of 2011, where unanimously the Security Council did issue an indictment of the Libyan regime for the abuses that were taking place within Libya. But that's manifestly the exception. Again, sovereignty is being protected in the UN system very strikingly.
Now, one last question for our viewers online. You mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we all take for granted today, but in 1948 it was a revolutionary manifesto that the United Nations issued, much to the surprise of, I think, many keen observers of international relations. And since then we've seen a huge development of ideas, frameworks, and norms in international relations that I don't think could have been predicted when the UN was created. It's been very incremental.
Yes.
And probably not something Mill would have worried about or dreamt about back then. He was dealing with the most basic of these dilemmas at the time.
Yeah, no, definitely. Now, some of his principles are still strongly relevant today, but and there was actually one very obscure passage where he talked about there is under very constrained circumstances, a duty to intervene. But he says, we know that this will be abused, but sometime in the as yet unforeseeable future, we will have an international organization to which states will feel comfortable entrusting very difficult determinations about when force should be used across borders. But that's something we can't even imagine today. So we now have that institution, the United Nations, to which states in 1945, in sense, have entrusted very important powers. States have the right to defend themselves, needless to say, and come to the defense of other states that request their assistance. But no other use of force is legal within standard international law, except that entrusted to the Security Council And the Council is given the authority to engage in prevention the way that no state is entrusted in doing so. So that was an extraordinary accomplishment in 1945, to entrust an international body with the legal authority to engage in the use, to authorize the use of force for something other than self-defense. Very, very striking. Now, the reality, of course, is very different. Member states took a big gulp when they looked at what they agreed to in San Francisco, and the Cold War swept most of that aside. But even when the Cold War disappeared, states have been very far from living up to the kind of commitments that are made in the Charter of 1945. The bad news. The good news, as you also suggested in your question, is that the UN has innovated in ways around the Charter. You and I are most familiar with peacekeeping, the famous chapter 6.5, neither in 6 nor fully in 7, so 6.5 is a whole mechanism to try to moderate and manage and hopefully solve various forms of international conflict. And then most recently, the other point we just referred to, R2P. That's going way beyond self-defense. It's going beyond international, which is the matter that is authorized within the UN Charter, to look inside countries' borders for countries that are abusing their own citizens, and again claiming that they'll be held accountable. It's quite a pleasant innovation.
And in principle, all of this is either actively supported or passively accepted by virtually all of the powers in the world today, which suggests that ideas that are unmentionable in one decade of the 20th century, in another may well, or in the 21st century, become much more acceptable and indeed commonplace.
Yes.
So the power of ideas is that they gain a foothold and then often they gain sway.
Yes.
Michael, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
For our viewers online, if you come to Tokyo or you're elsewhere in Tokyo, do remember that we have public conversations a couple of times a month. Our programs and institutes in 16 or 17 other countries in the world also stage public events. So do please look us up as you travel around where UNU is present, because public participation we enjoy tremendously. Thank you.